The storm arrived with little warning, like an unexpected guest crashing into the quiet of the night. Lakewood, Ohio, a peaceful suburb nestled along the outskirts of Cleveland, was known for its tree-lined streets and small-town charm. The neighborhood, made up of modest homes with well-kept lawns, sat quietly under the soft golden glow of streetlights. But tonight, the usual calm was disrupted by the sudden brewing of a fierce storm. The sky above was a swirl of dark clouds, their heavy masses twisting and churning as if the heavens themselves were preparing for something monumental. The air was thick and heavy with moisture, and the smell of rain was already in the air, a sharp, electric scent that hinted at the chaos to come. The wind picked up, howling through the branches of the towering oak trees that lined the streets, their leaves rustling violently in the gusts. The branches creaked under the strain, bending as the storm grew stronger. Lakewood was a place where people knew their neighbors by name, where children played in the park and families sat on their porches in the evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The houses were not grand, but they were cozy, the kind of place where everyone felt safe, until now. The storm rattled windows and made power lines sway ominously in the wind. Every thunderclap that split the air felt like the sky itself was cracking open. Inside a modest two-bedroom home on Maple Avenue, the storm's fury could be heard but not felt. The warmth of the house was a contrast to the chaos outside. The scent of homemade chicken soup filled the air, offering a small comfort amidst the growing storm. The house, with its soft wooden floors and simple furniture, was a haven from the outside world. Yet even inside, there was a quiet unease, an unspoken anticipation in the air that something out of the ordinary, was about to happen. As the wind battered against the windows and the storm raged, no one could have predicted that this very night, a life-changing encounter was about to take place. Danny Thomas was a 5-year-old boy whose every day was filled with wonder. His small, round face was framed by unruly brown curls that fell into his wide, curious eyes, which sparkled with the kind of innocence that only a child of his age could possess. He was small for his age, but his energy seemed to fill the room, making him seem larger than life. His cheeks were dotted with a light sprinkling of freckles, the kind that only appeared after days spent running through the summer sun, and his smile was infectious, lighting up his entire face. On this particular evening, Danny was sprawled on the living room carpet, surrounded by his favorite toys. His fingers, small and nimble, were carefully stacking wooden blocks into a colorful tower. His concentration was intense, as if the blocks in front of him were the most important thing in the world. He tilted his head to the side, his tongue poking out slightly in a habit he had developed when he was a baby, a quirk that always made Grace, his mother, smile when she saw it. Danny's blue dinosaur pajamas were his pride and joy. They had been his favorite for months, and the soft fabric was worn in all the right places. He loved the way the fabric felt against his skin and how the bright colors made him feel like he was part of an adventure. It was a comfort in his young world, simple, but perfect. He wasn't concerned with anything else right now. For him, everything felt right, just as it should be. Grace, his mother, had been keeping an eye on him from the kitchen, where she stirred the chicken soup. The house was filled with the comforting scent of simmering vegetables and herbs, but something in the air tonight seemed to distract Danny from his usual happiness. He was unusually still, his hand hovering mid-air as he held a red block. His gaze shifted from the blocks to the window. "Dinner in 15 minutes, sweetheart," Grace called from the kitchen, but Danny didn't respond. His small hand remained frozen, his face serious as his eyes grew wide and fixed on something outside. His silence was uncharacteristic. Danny's imagination was wild, and though his toys often held his full attention, something beyond the window had caught his notice. His quiet demeanor was replaced by a look of concern, one that Grace, even from the kitchen, instantly recognized. Danny's small hand stayed frozen in mid-air, his fingers gripping the red block, but his focus had clearly shifted. His dark eyes, usually filled with laughter, were now wide, staring into the pitch-black night outside the window. Grace had noticed his sudden silence and stillness. He was always so full of energy, so to see him so transfixed was unusual. "Danny," she called softly, her voice laced with concern. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and stepped toward him. "What are you looking at, honey?" Danny didn't answer immediately. His face remained serious, his small fingers pressing harder against the cool glass. Grace stood behind him, trying to peer out the window, but the storm outside was intense. The wind howled, and the rain pelted against the glass, almost drowning out everything else. There was nothing but darkness beyond their yard, save for the occasional flicker of lightning. "Sweetheart, what is it?" Grace asked, her voice a little more worried now. Danny turned his head slightly, his eyes wide with what looked like both concern and focus. "Someone's crying," he whispered, his voice barely louder than the storm outside. Grace frowned, stepping closer. She couldn't hear anything but the relentless wind and the rain. "Crying? Are you sure, honey?" "It's just the storm," she tried to reassure him. Danny shook his head, his gaze never leaving the window. "It's not the wind, Mommy," he said quietly, his voice firm and insistent for such a young child. "Someone's hurt. We need to help." Grace felt a chill run down her spine. Danny wasn't one to make things up, he had always been perceptive, but he wasn't the type to imagine things. She looked at him, then back out the window, straining her ears to hear what he was hearing. The wind was so loud, the rain so furious, but then, amidst the chaos of the storm, she thought she heard it too. A soft, faint whimper, barely audible above the noise. She felt her heart skip. The sound, though faint, was unmistakable. It was a cry of pain. Turning back to Danny, she saw how serious he was, how sure he was that someone outside needed help. His eyes, wide with worry, pleaded with her. Grace hesitated for a moment, uncertainty swirling inside her. It was dangerous outside, and the storm was far from letting up. But the urgency in Danny's eyes left her no choice. She knelt down beside him, gently brushing the curls from his forehead. "I'll go check," she said softly, though her heart was pounding in her chest. "But you stay inside, okay? I'll be right back." Danny's face lit up with relief, but his concern never left. He squeezed her hand before she stood up and grabbed her raincoat. The moment Grace opened the door, the storm hit her like a wall. The wind nearly pushed her back into the house, and the rain drenched her in seconds. She squinted into the dark, trying to make out anything beyond the porch light. But the world outside was a blur of shadows and rain. "Hello?" she called, her voice muffled by the storm. "Is anyone there?" The only response was the wind and the relentless pounding of the rain. She looked around, but there was no sign of life. And then, just as Danny had said, the cry came again. It was faint, but this time, unmistakable. It sounded like an animal in pain. Grace's heart sank. This wasn't the wind. Someone, or something, was out there, crying for help. She took a shaky breath and moved further into the storm, determined to find the source of the sound. Grace crouched down beside the injured dog, her heart racing as she examined the German Shepherd. Its fur was matted with mud and blood, and its right front leg twisted in an unnatural angle. The dog was lying motionless on the cold driveway, barely able to lift its head. Grace's breath hitched as she saw the amber eyes flicker open, locking onto hers. There was a deep pain in those eyes, physical and emotional. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice trembling. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing the dog's fur. The dog flinched slightly at her touch but didn't growl or snap. It seemed too weak to react aggressively. Instead, it let out a soft, pitiful whimper, its chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. "Hey there," Grace murmured softly. "It's okay. We're going to get you help. You're not alone." She could hardly believe what she was seeing. The poor animal had clearly been through a great deal. Its leg was broken, and it was obvious that without assistance, it wouldn't survive the storm. Grace's heart twisted in her chest. She had to get the dog inside, but how? The German Shepherd was large, easily 70 pounds or more, and its body was limp with exhaustion. Grace looked back toward the house, where Danny stood at the window, his small hands pressed against the glass, his face filled with concern. She could see the worry in his eyes, but Grace knew she couldn't take him outside in this storm. The only option was for her to act quickly and get the dog inside herself. "Max," she whispered under her breath. She hadn't asked the dog its name, but somehow, in that moment, the name felt right. "We're going to get you inside, okay?" She stood up and moved toward the door, grabbing the beach towel hanging on the hook by the front door. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. She returned to the dog's side, carefully sliding the towel underneath its body. The dog let out another weak whimper, its eyes locking onto hers in silent trust. Grace didn't want to hurt it, but she had to move it. With a deep breath, Grace tried to lift the dog gently, using the towel as a makeshift stretcher. The dog's broken leg hung awkwardly in the air, and Grace winced as the dog let out another pained whimper. But it didn't struggle. It just lay there, as if it knew she was trying to help. As Grace strained to lift the dog, headlights suddenly flashed through the rain. A car was pulling into the driveway. Relief surged through her. She recognized the car, Mr. Reeves, their neighbor. Mr. Reeves. Grace called out, her voice thick with desperation. Please, help us. Mr. Reeves stepped out of his car, squinting into the rain. When he saw the injured dog, his eyes widened in shock. What happened? He asked. It's hurt, Grace replied quickly. Can you help me get it inside? Mr. Reeves hesitated, his eyes darting to the dog and back to Grace. That's not your dog, is it? No, Grace said firmly. But it's injured. It needs help now. Please. Mr. Reeves took a step back, looking uncomfortable. Sorry, Grace. I can't help with strays. You should call animal control. Grace felt a wave of frustration. But it's dying out here. It's injured badly. Please, can't you help me? Mr. Reeves shook his head. It's dangerous. It could have diseases. You should call animal control. With that, he turned and hurried inside, leaving Grace standing in the pouring rain. She felt a lump form in her throat. Why couldn't anyone just help? She turned back to the German Shepherd, its amber eyes still fixed on her. Despite the rejection, Grace's determination grew. She couldn't leave this animal to suffer. No one else will help you, she whispered. But I will. With that, she pulled the towel tighter around the dog and began the slow, difficult process of lifting it toward the door. The storm raged on, but Grace didn't care. She couldn't leave Max out here alone any longer. Grace's muscles burned as she carefully maneuvered the injured dog toward the door, her hands shaking with the effort. The storm had grown even fiercer, the rain now coming down in sheets, soaking through her clothes and making the driveway slippery. She gritted her teeth, determined to get Max inside, but each step felt like a small victory. The dog's body was heavy, its limp form not cooperating with her efforts. She could feel the towel slipping from beneath the dog's body, and the poor creature whimpered softly, its broken leg dragging awkwardly in the wet mud. Grace had to pause several times, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she gathered the strength to keep going. Every tug on the towel seemed to cause Max more pain, but she couldn't stop now. She couldn't just leave him outside, exposed to the cold, the rain, and the storm. The sound of her heart beating in her ears was the only thing louder than the storm around her. She could barely see through the curtain of rain, but the porch light cast enough of a glow to guide her steps. As she dragged Max closer to the door, she kept whispering words of comfort to him, even though she wasn't sure if he could hear her. You're doing great, Max. We're almost there. Just a little bit more. Her hands were soaked, and the towel had become slippery from the rainwater, but she wasn't going to give up. She had no choice. Every time she looked at Max's pain-filled eyes, she felt a wave of desperation and determination wash over her. She had to get him inside. He needed warmth, he needed medical attention, and most of all, he needed to feel safe. Finally, with a last, exhausting effort, Grace managed to drag Max's limp form to the front door. Her body ached, and she could feel the muscles in her arms trembling from the strain, but the sight of the warm house just beyond the door gave her the strength to keep going. Max's breathing was shallow, and Grace knew the urgency of the situation. She needed help, she couldn't lift him alone, not in his condition. She paused at the door, trying to catch her breath, and glanced back toward the window, where she saw Danny still watching. His face was pressed against the glass, his small hands on the window pane, his eyes wide with worry. "Mommy," he called out softly, his voice faint over the sound of the rain. "Is he okay?" Grace didn't know how to answer. She could feel the lump in her throat, the worry and exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. She smiled at Danny, trying to reassure him, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "He's going to be okay, sweetheart. We just need to get him inside." She pushed the door open with one hand, the other still holding the towel beneath Max's body. The cold air rushed in, mixing with the warmth of the house, but Grace didn't care. She focused solely on getting Max inside. With the door now open, she moved slowly, carefully dragging him through the threshold. As she did, Max's tail gave a faint, weak wag, brushing against the floor. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Grace a sliver of hope. "Good boy, Max," she whispered, as she finally managed to get him past the door and into the living room. She collapsed beside him on the floor, her breath ragged, but her heart felt a little lighter. He was inside, safe from the storm. But she knew the hard part was far from over. Grace crouched beside Max, her heart racing as she tried to comfort the injured dog. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the house, the warmth offered a brief moment of respite. Max's breathing was still shallow, his eyes flickering with pain and exhaustion. Grace knew she couldn't waste any more time. The storm had made everything more difficult, but she couldn't leave him in the state he was in. "Come on, Max," she whispered, reaching for the blanket she had placed on the couch. Gently, she covered him with it, trying to keep him warm. His fur was soaked, and his broken leg was still visibly twisted. She could hear the low, painful whimpers that escaped him with every shallow breath. She grabbed her phone and dialed the emergency vet number, her hands shaking. After a few moments, a tired voice answered on the other end. "This is Dr. Patel. How can I help?" "Hi, it's Grace Wilson. I found a dog, a German Shepherd, and he's hurt badly. I don't know if we can wait until morning to get him help. His leg is broken, and I'm not sure what else is wrong," Grace said, her voice strained with worry. There was a brief silence before Dr. Patel replied. "I'll see if I can get someone out there, but with the storm, it may take a while. If you can, try to keep him calm, warm, and don't move him too much." Grace nodded, even though Dr. Patel couldn't see her. "Thank you," she whispered before ending the call. Returning to Max, she placed her hand gently on his head, offering him comfort. She could feel the warmth of his body, but it was clear he needed more than just warmth, he needed medical care. Grace moved slowly, repositioning him carefully on the rug, making sure not to aggravate his injuries. "You're not alone now, Max. I won't leave you," she murmured, her voice full of determination. Max let out a soft, pitiful whimper in response, his tail giving the faintest of wags. The storm outside continued to howl, but Grace knew that, at least for now, Max was safe. She wasn't sure what the next hours would bring, but she would stay with him. She would do whatever it took to help him through the night. Grace stayed by his side, her mind racing, but her heart remained steadfast. She wasn't going to let Max suffer alone, not when she could do something to help. Grace sat quietly beside Max, watching him closely. The German Shepherd lay on the living room rug, his large body still, save for the occasional twitch of his tail. The storm outside had passed, but the heavy feeling of uncertainty lingered in the air. Max's breathing had become steadier, though his broken leg was still clearly in need of care. Grace knew that even though he had made it through the night, the real challenge was just beginning. She had covered him with a soft blanket, and the room was warm with the glow of the lamp she had left on for him. Max's fur was still damp from the storm, and she could see the gash on his side where he had been injured before he came to her. Grace had gently cleaned it the best she could, but she knew the pain was still there. His eyes met hers occasionally, filled with a trust and loyalty that she hadn't expected from a stray dog. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention away from Max. It was a message from the emergency vet, Dr. Patel. "Help is on the way. I'll be there in about an hour. Hang in there." Grace let out a sigh of relief. She didn't know how much longer she could manage on her own, especially with everything that had happened. But Max wasn't alone anymore. He had made it through the night, and she would be there for him every step of the way. She stood up and moved into the kitchen, where she prepared a small bowl of water for Max. When she returned, she placed it gently in front of him, her hands trembling slightly as she set it down. Max looked at her, then at the water. He raised his head weakly and licked the edge of the bowl, but his movements were slow, hesitant. Grace knelt beside him again, stroking his head, speaking softly. "You're doing so well, Max. You're strong, you're going to be okay." Max let out a soft sigh, closing his eyes as he rested his head back down on the floor. Grace's heart swelled with affection for this dog who had shown such resilience despite the odds. She knew the road ahead would be long for him, but it didn't matter. She had promised she wouldn't leave him alone, and that was a promise she intended to keep. The minutes stretched on, each one filled with a mixture of hope and worry. Would he get better? Would the vet be able to help him? As Grace sat beside Max, she couldn't help but wonder what had brought him to her doorstep that night. Whatever it was, she was grateful. She had a new purpose now, not just to help Max recover, but to make sure he knew he was loved, safe, and cared for. When the sound of tires crunching on the wet gravel reached her ears, Grace's heart gave a small leap. Help was finally here. As Dr. Patel entered the house, her presence was a relief to Grace. The vet's warm smile and calm demeanor put Grace at ease, though her anxiety was still palpable. Dr. Patel walked over to Max, crouching down beside him with a practiced gentleness. "Hey there, big guy," she murmured, her fingers gently tracing the German shepherd's side, examining his injuries. Max lifted his head slightly, his amber eyes meeting Dr. Patel's with a quiet, understanding gaze. It was clear that, despite his pain, the dog was trusting these strangers to help him. Grace stood back, watching the interaction. The bond between the two, Max and the vet, seemed instantaneous. There was a familiarity there, an unspoken understanding, as if Max knew that help had finally arrived. His tail, which had been so still only moments before, gave a soft thump against the floor. It was a faint sign of comfort, but it was there. "He's a strong one," Dr. Patel said softly, nodding as she continued her examination. "We're lucky you found him when you did." Grace smiled, though her eyes were filled with a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. "I wasn't sure if he was going to make it through the night," she admitted. "I'm just so glad he's here." Max's eyes shifted to Grace, locking onto hers. There was a silent communication between them, an invisible thread that seemed to pull them closer. Grace felt a lump form in her throat as she looked into the dog's eyes. It was as if, in that brief moment, they were connected on a deeper level, one that didn't need words to be understood. Dr. Patel worked efficiently, wrapping Max's broken leg and administering pain relief. Max let out a soft, almost contented sigh as the pain seemed to ebb, the relief settling into his body. Grace crouched beside him, resting her hand gently on his head. It felt as though the dog understood the kindness being offered. "Max will need some time to recover," Dr. Patel said, standing up and giving Grace a reassuring smile. "But he's strong, and he's in good hands now." Grace nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. She had never thought a simple act of kindness, bringing in a hurt dog from a storm, would lead to something so profound. She could feel it now, the pull, the deep connection that had formed between her and Max, something beyond mere chance. She wasn't sure what it was, but she knew it was real. As Dr. Patel packed up her equipment and prepared to leave, Grace remained by Max's side, her hand still resting on his fur. Max let out a soft whine, looking up at her with those eyes full of silent trust. "You're not alone anymore, Max," Grace whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We'll get through this together." It was as if the dog understood. His tail thumped again, a quiet affirmation, before he settled down once more. Grace stayed with him, her heart filled with a sense of purpose. There was something special about this bond, something inexplicable but undeniable. Max had come into her life for a reason, and as she sat there, watching him begin to drift into a peaceful sleep, Grace knew she had found a true friend, one who had chosen her just as much as she had chosen to help him. The next evening, as the house settled into an uneasy calm, Grace found herself sitting quietly in the living room, watching Max as he lay on his bed, his breathing deeper and more even than it had been just hours earlier. His broken leg was carefully bandaged, and he seemed more relaxed, though his gaze would occasionally flick toward Grace, as if reassuring himself that she was still there. Danny was in his room, engrossed in his toys, and the house was peaceful, almost too peaceful. But something in the air felt off, like an unspoken tension that couldn't quite be explained. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock on the door. Grace stood up, startled. She wasn't expecting anyone, not this late. The storm had passed, but the night still felt heavy with the remnants of it. She walked cautiously toward the door, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the doorknob. Before she could open it, she heard a voice, low and urgent. "Grace?" It was a man's voice, gravelly, with an unfamiliar edge. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the voice, but she couldn't place it. She hesitated, the hairs on the back of her neck rising as she glanced toward Max. The German shepherd's ears perked up, his body stiffening slightly as he sensed her unease. "Yes?" Grace called through the door, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's me, Jim Reeves, your neighbor," the man said. His voice carried an undertone of worry. "I need to speak with you." Grace's pulse quickened. She opened the door cautiously, peering out into the darkness. The man standing before her was someone she had only waved to a few times in passing, Jim Reeves. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, his hair graying at the temples. His face was weathered, as though the years had not been kind, but his eyes now showed a certain urgency that made her stomach twist. "Jim? What's going on?" Grace asked, concern creeping into her voice. Jim glanced nervously over his shoulder before looking back at her. His eyes darted toward the dark yard behind her house, then quickly back to her. I need help," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "There's something strange going on. I think someone's been watching us." Grace's breath caught in her throat. She felt a chill run down her spine as Max began to growl softly, his body tensing even more. Something was wrong, and she had no idea how bad it was about to get. Grace stepped back, instinctively shielding the door as Jim Reeves took a step closer, his eyes darting nervously. Max, who had been resting quietly, now stood with his ears alert, growling lowly at the strange energy outside. Grace felt a sense of foreboding settle in her chest. "What do you mean someone's been watching us?" she asked, her voice steady, but her mind racing. Jim hesitated, glancing over his shoulder once more before stepping closer. "Look, this isn't easy to explain. But something happened earlier tonight, and I need to tell you." His voice lowered, barely above a whisper. "There's been talk around town about your dog. Max." Grace felt her breath catch. "What about Max?" she asked, her heart pounding in her chest. She stepped aside to let him in, locking the door behind them. The last thing she wanted was to hear something that might change everything she thought she knew. Jim's eyes met hers, filled with an intensity that made Grace shiver. I've heard rumors. Things that don't make sense. But now I think I've figured it out." He took a deep breath, clearly gathering the courage to continue. "The thing is, Max isn't just some random stray, Grace." Grace's heart skipped a beat. She stared at him, completely confused. "What are you saying?" Jim rubbed his forehead, as though trying to compose himself before continuing. "Max. He's not just any German shepherd. He used to belong to a retired police officer, Thomas Fletcher. He had a special job, scent detection. But there's more to it. He was trained for something, beyond that." Jim hesitated, his voice low and serious. "I think Max saw something he wasn't supposed to see. Something bad." Grace stood frozen, her mind trying to process the sudden revelation. "Are you saying Max has been involved in something criminal?" Jim nodded, a grave expression on his face. "Not by choice. But Max, he's more than just a dog. He's seen things that could put him, and anyone close to him, in danger." Grace felt a chill crawl down her spine. She turned her gaze toward Max, who was now standing quietly, his amber eyes fixed on her with an expression that seemed almost knowing. Suddenly, it all clicked. The strange connection between Max and her son, Noah, the way Max had appeared out of nowhere, just when they needed him most. Grace's heart tightened. This dog, this gentle animal who had saved her family, was far more than just a stray. He was a witness, caught in something bigger than any of them. "Max isn't just our protector," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's been running from something." Jim nodded. "Exactly. And whoever was after him. They haven't given up yet." Grace looked down at Max, who was now watching her with quiet understanding. A new weight settled over her. This wasn't just about helping an injured dog anymore. They were all in something much deeper, something far more dangerous. The next morning, the atmosphere in Grace's home felt heavier than it had in days. The revelation from Jim weighed on her, but there was no turning back now. Max had already proven himself to be more than just a stray dog, he was part of their family, and nothing could change that. Grace sat on the couch, her hand resting gently on Max's head, who was lying peacefully by her side. His broken leg was healing, and his demeanor was calmer now, though there was an alertness about him that didn't go unnoticed. Danny had gone off to school, and Noah had retreated to his room for a while. The house felt unusually quiet, as if everyone was waiting for the next step to unfold. But Grace knew one thing for sure: Max was no longer just a guest in their home. He belonged here, with them. The more she thought about it, the more it became clear to her. Max had saved them, but now it was her turn to offer him a safe place, permanently. She couldn't send him back, not after everything they'd been through together. He had brought more than just comfort to her family, he had brought a sense of security, of protection. And he had earned his place in their lives. Grace had already spoken to Dr. Patel about his recovery, and the vet confirmed that Max was well on his way to full physical healing. But it wasn't just his body that needed care now. It was his spirit, too. Max had suffered, and though he didn't speak, there was a certain wariness in his eyes, a trace of the trauma he had endured. Grace couldn't undo the past, but she could give him a future. "I'm going to make sure you're safe," she whispered softly to him, her voice filled with conviction. Max looked up at her, his amber eyes filled with gratitude, and for the first time in days, Grace felt the weight of her decision lift. Max was home, for good. That evening, as the sun set and the house grew quiet, Grace sat at the kitchen table, her thoughts still swirling around the events of the past few days. Max was resting in the living room, his broken leg now supported by a sturdy brace, and Noah was playing on the floor beside him, his small hands gently stroking the dog's fur. Grace watched them for a moment, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace settle over her. This was what mattered: family. She and Danny had worked hard to build a life together, and in the midst of all the chaos, they had found something unexpected, something beautiful. Max was not just a stray dog anymore. He was their protector, their companion, and above all, a member of their family. When Danny walked through the door, tired from a long day at work, he immediately spotted the scene in front of him. Max, lying comfortably on the rug, surrounded by Noah's toys, and Noah, his small face filled with happiness as he laughed softly, talking to Max as if the dog understood every word. Danny smiled, his expression softening as he saw the bond between his son and the German Shepherd. "Looks like you two are doing better," he remarked, dropping his bag by the door and walking over to join them. Noah looked up with wide eyes. "Max is staying forever, right, Daddy?" His voice was filled with certainty, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. Danny knelt beside his son, brushing a hand through his hair. "Yes, buddy. Max is staying forever. He's part of the family now." His words were simple, but they held all the weight of the promise he was making to Noah, and to Max. Grace walked over, standing beside Danny. She smiled, her heart full. "We're all in this together," she said softly, her hand resting on Max's head as he looked up at her with trusting eyes. For the first time in days, Grace felt a deep sense of relief. No matter what had happened in the past, this was their future now. They were a family, united by love, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond they had forged through everything. And that was all that mattered. The story of Max, the injured dog who found his way into a loving home, teaches us a powerful lesson about empathy, resilience, and the unspoken bonds we share with the animals in our lives. It reminds us that sometimes, it's the smallest acts of kindness, like opening our hearts and homes to those in need, that create the most profound connections. Max didn't just find safety, he gave back love, protection, and loyalty in return. It's a reminder to all of us that kindness and compassion can change lives, both human and animal. In our busy lives, we often overlook the importance of helping others, but the story of Max shows us that even in moments of fear and uncertainty, love and empathy can guide us to do the right thing. Animals like Max offer us unconditional love, and in return, we owe them our care and respect. Let's all remember to be the helpers, to open our hearts to those who need us, and to cherish the connections that can transform lives. If you were touched by Max's story, don't forget to subscribe to Paw Prints and Stories for more heartwarming tales that remind us of the special bond between humans and animals. Join our community of animal lovers and storytellers, and let's spread kindness together. Click that subscribe button and become part of our journey today.